Thank you for coming to our session today on the new Oxford Handbook for Religion and American Education. And thank you also to the Committee on the Public Understanding of Religion for providing this time. And I particularly want to thank my colleague, friend, and co-editor, Nate Walker, for inviting me into this project. The contract for this book was signed 5 years ago at this meeting. It's 2013 BT, before Trump. We can't unknow what has happened in the last few years, and for me it has underscored the urgency and the purpose for this book. For a number of us, for a number of years, there's been a concern about the lack of education about religion in our public schools and higher ed institutions. An education towards the end of increasing religious literacy in all its dimensions in the service of enhancing liberal democracy. The seismic shift in national thinking on this issue, created by the quakes of the court decisions in the 1960s, with continuing tremors still, set in motion what would become the religious right, but also parallel initiatives to teach religion in constitutionally appropriate manner in the public schools. The highly decentralized nature of schools leaves curricular decision-making at the behest of some 13,000 public school districts, school boards, comprising nearly 100,000 public schools, where 90% of the U.S. students are taught. This frustrates almost any large-scale initiative about teaching about religion in the curriculum. And as I said at the outset, this was conceived in the BT era. I admit to being among those lulled into thinking that we had achieved a state of societal enlightenment signified by the election of an African-American president, possibly followed by a woman as president, all but ushering in a new millennium of socially evolved humanity. This, of course, would be opening the door to introducing religious literacy in all its nuances on multiple fronts here in the U.S., and this book would stand ready as a resource to analyze the many issues involved in the contexts in which this could be accomplished. Well, the 2016 election and its continuing aftershocks altered the landscape for many of us. The environment in which nuance was the ideal seemed to vanish overnight. How has our role as educators about religion been impacted, changed by what we've experienced and hopefully learned? This book continues in its value, I believe, to be the same resource for which it was intended. However, how it will be employed in our brave new world remains to be seen. The niceties of nuanced discourse in public settings seems a challenging, ever more remote ideal. But what would gloves off, bare-knuckled religion education look like, if there even is such a thing? At any rate, the objective of this initiative seems more important than ever, given our altered context. And today we'd like to offer a look at some of the issues explored in this volume by featuring 4 of the 40 authors who contributed to the work. This handbook aims to examine the current state of religion and American education, from homeschooling to private religious schools, to public schools, to religious institutions, and on through the range of public and private higher education. The book is organized into 5 sections: frameworks, lifespan faith development, faith-based K-12 education, religion and public schools, and religion and higher education. The first unit, Frameworks, is designed to expose readers from a variety of disciplines to the frameworks that inform the study of religion and education: privatism, secularism, pluralism, religious literacy, religious liberty, and democracy. Rather than stereotypes of ideological perspectives, these chapters are designed to provide a sympathetic summary of schools of thought. Faith Development, the second unit, surveys the various ways that 3 institutions, the family, religion, and the state can contribute to the moral, intellectual, and faith development of learners across the lifespans. The third unit on faith-based education surveys the various pedagogical, political, and legal issues associated with homeschooling, private religious schools, and religiously affiliated charter schools. Public schools have proven to be the primary locus for the major church-state battles in the United States and is the focus of the fourth unit. These legal issues can be classified into 5 areas in which the state tends to regulate religion in public schools: religious expression, curricula, extracurricular activities, religious displays, and access to facilities. The fifth and final section addresses the current state of American higher education as it has evolved from its colonial beginnings, examining the place of religion within and across each of its sectors. I could not be more pleased to have these scholars with us today to speak to their work within these sections. First, Jonathan Kahn from Vassar College will speak to us from his chapter on secularism and religion in American education. Then Stephen Green from Willamette University on religion relative to public funding. Then Mark Chancey from Southern Methodist University on the Bible and public schools. Our fourth author was to be Rhonda Jacobson of Messiah College, speaking on religion and higher education. Regrettably, she had to leave early. However, I prevailed upon another colleague and Handbook author in attendance, John Smaltzbauer from Missouri State University, to present her remarks. John also contributed to the Handbook chapter on campus ministry, and has, I should say, just a couple months ago, published a book with Kathleen Mahoney for Baylor University Press entitled The Resilience of Religion in American Higher Education. I got to see an early draft, and I highly recommend it. So thank you, John. Nate Walker, co-editor of this project, will conclude with his remarks and facilitate the discussion that follows. So again, thank you, and turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Good afternoon, everybody. So as Mike said, I have an essay in the framework section of the volume. I'd like to begin by thanking Nate and Mike for including me in this tremendous volume. It's a real honor. The volume's a great teaching volume. It's for reading with others, students especially, to get them and all of us to think about the conditions of this thing we do. So I'd like to begin with a few words on the recently politically departed. In the winter of 2015, Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker unveiled his budget plan for the University of Wisconsin. Along with his radical budget cuts to the state system, Walker brazenly deleted the soaring language of the university's century-old hallowed mission statement, language that stands at the core of what's known as the Wisconsin idea. Under Walker's dispensation, gone was over a 100-year Wisconsin idea's insistence on, quote, developing in students heightened intellectual, cultural, and humane sensitivities and a sense of purpose, close quote. No longer, under Walker's vision, would the University of Wisconsin envision education as, quote, designed to educate people and improve the human condition. That's also from the Wisconsin idea. And in a final fatal blow, Walker excised the credo's most cherished claim, quote, basic to every purpose of the system is the search for truth. In their place, Walker added new language that fixed the purpose of university education on, quote, meeting the state's workforce needs. The New York Times quipped, it was as if a trade school agenda was substituted for the idea of a university. So the backlash against these changes was immediate and overwhelming. The people of Wisconsin, from all sides of the political spectrum, skewered their governor. Very quickly, Walker backtracked from these proposed changes, disowning them as an unintentional drafting error, maybe a preview of the Trump era. Clearly, Walker had unknowingly stepped on a third rail of Wisconsin politics. Walker had profaned his state's sacred. Despite a continuingly difficult economy, and despite electing a Republican governor whose overall agenda effectively asserts that education is worth little more than its technocratic efficiencies, the citizens of Wisconsin demanded that their university's education aspire to broad-minded considerations of the true and the good. It's as if the citizens of Wisconsin in the 21st century were channeling their progressive era forebears, those forebears who wrote the Wisconsin ideal, whose sentiments can be succinctly captured by W.B. Du Bois from that same era. Quote, "Is not life more than meat, and body more than raiment? And men ask this today all the more eagerly because of the sinister signs in recent educational movements." Du Bois, of course, could be speaking as much about today. So Walker versus the Wisconsin idea reveals the highly contested and deeply uncertain nature of secular education in America. Consider that what Walker and his citizenry differ on is not whether a Wisconsin education should be secular, but rather what a secular education consists of. In this case, the secular was decidedly not, at least for the citizens of Wisconsin, what Max Weber might have claimed it was, which is disenchanted, where, quote, "the ultimate and most sublime values have retreated from public life," end quote. Something non-secular, something spiritual, something maybe even religious looms large in the Wisconsin idea. And so what I tried to do in my contribution to the volume is to describe these loomings. I do this in 3 parts. In the first, I spend some time working with what I call the new secular critics, folks like Charles Taylor and Jeff Stout, Saba Mahmood, and Talal Assad, and I lay out the ways in which they argue that the relationship between the secular and the religious needs to be understood as always intertwined and mutually constituting. More sort of the Book of Ruth, for where you go, I will go, and where you will lodge, I will lodge, than, say, Peter Berger's secularization thesis. These critics attune us to the way the conventional idea about the secular as a fair and neutral plane free from the irrationalities of religion is a mythic creation, one that often proclaims its own innocence and disavows its own power. In the second part of the essay, I explore the way the creation story of innocence and disavowal of power is at play in the development of higher education in the late 19th and early 20th century, as higher ed institutions either ignore or explicitly drop their Christian past in the pursuit of epistemological progress, objective, accurate forms of knowledge, so they think. Using Christian Smith's work, I argue that the forms of epistemological progress are deeply shaped and formed by inchoate moral and spiritual ideals that are the close relatives of these institutions' Christian past. Again, much more Book of Ruth than Peter Berger. The third section of the paper tries to address what counts as our modern crisis in higher education, that is, in this moment. In a direct way, I encourage us all to ask the honest and plain questions: what are we doing when we're educating liberal arts students? I encourage us all, religious, non-religious, spiritual but not religious, atheists, to own the fact that no matter what we think counts as the best forms of knowledge, we are engaged in the work of character formation. And the best version of secular universities, places that are not explicitly denominational, yet they're honest about the ways that multiple dispensations inform their daily practices, that the best of these need to address directly the conditions of character formation in pluralistic contexts. What's interesting is that a raft of contemporary critics that I look at who worry about the state of higher ed, from Andrew Delbanco and Michael Roth on the so-called secular left, to Christian critics like Stanley Hauerwas or Rhonda Jacobson, who contributed to our volume, how they are all urging similar things. They can be best summarized by Delbanco's astonishing urging that we need to be working at learning how, quote, to receive another's soul. Secular education settings should probably admit that they have no idea how to do this. They might also understand the endless controversies around free speech and identity on campus as a failure to how to know to receive another's soul. The broader ongoing tumult on college campuses, whether about race or sexual violence or free speech, I think can be productively reframed as students questioning the secular constraints of university life. What both my students and students nationally are saying is this: more talking, more panel discussions, more rational deliberation, more secular modes of learning are not what is needed now. What is needed now are other, more productive ways of engaging others, where the very terms of engagement are rethought. In the final moments of my essay, I suggest that it's time that perhaps we in the Secular Academy begin thinking of our educational practices as liturgical, education as liturgy, as public enactments that shape desires and articulate forms of human flourishing. Liturgy shapes desires through bodily performances and practices and not through the mind's epistemic capacities. What would it mean to think that the crucial purpose of our work in the classroom is not to think the right answer, but to learn, in Hauerwas's words, quote, to act wisely in a context of conflict, ambiguity, and change, close quote. Doing so would mean to think of the work of knowledge formation as an awakening to the affects of interaction and not as achieving rational sovereignty. Might we have the courage to risk embarrassment and ridicule in our quixotic pedagogical attempts to foster communities that we have not yet quite imagined? Thank you.
Good afternoon. As Mike said, I'm Steve Green. I teach at Willamette University. And I want to also thank Mike and Nate for putting together this anthology. This is probably about the 10th anthology that I've there's another one coming out, okay, so this is probably the 9th anthology I participated in, but I've participated in about 10. And let me just say, I think this is the best product that I've seen. It's really well done and really well thought out and constructed and organized. So I really want to commend you two on doing that. And then it has also made me realize, having recently been asked to edit an anthology and turning it down because I realized how much work this would be, that it is a commitment of love, I think, to do something like this. And you don't get a whole lot of glory out of it sometimes. So again, it's a really nice piece of addition to the literature. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about public funding of religious schools, and something that in some ways is near and dear to my heart, and I'll get into that. I probably should begin by a disclosure. My primary appointment is actually as a law professor at Willamette University, but I also teach in religious studies and in the history department because I have a PhD also. So I approach these things primarily from a legal historical perspective. But in addition to that, even further disclosure is I've also been a litigator, and some of the more recent church-state cases that deal with public funding, as well as some that Mark will be talking about in his area, I've participated in. So I try to be objective as I can when I'm writing and making presentations, but sometimes it's hard to be objective when you know some of the skeletons behind some of these cases. All right. Well, religion and public education. Okay. Well, I'm a church-state scholar and historian, and when I think about church-state, you can't think about church and state without thinking about religion and education. It is by far the central focus of at least the development of church-state jurisprudence and our thinking about church and state. Without a doubt, there are a lot of issues out there that do not involve religion in education today. In fact, they seem to be the more salient issues. The Supreme Court has just granted cert review in a case dealing with a large cross on public property outside Washington, D.C. So it's a religious display issue. And also what we've been seeing more recently have been cases that have been involving questions of religious exemptions or exemptions based upon religious claims from public accommodations laws or adhering to the Affordable Care Act. And so these are really kind of the hot button issues at present. But still, when you go back and look at the slow, long development of church-state thinking, church-state jurisprudence, no issue has been more central to the development of that jurisprudence and that cultural thought than the intersection of religion and education. And then, not to highlight necessarily the significance of this chapter I wrote and the chapter that Mark and a couple others wrote, no issue or issues have had greater impact than the development of the twin issues of religious expression in public education and the public funding of religious schooling. In fact, the subtitle to my third book It was the conflict that shaped modern church-state doctrine. And I think it truly was. Okay. Now, most people think in discrete areas, and certainly the court thinks in categories. That's one thing we try to teach, drill into the heads of all these law students, is categorical thinking. That issues of religious expression in public schools and then public funding of religious education are two distinct issues. I've spent a fair amount of my scholarship trying to establish the integral connection of these two back in the 19th century and how they really only kind of diverged in the 20th century as being distinct issues. Again, I'll let Mark talk about the religious education question. I'm talking about the public funding question. Okay. Well, this is really where it started, in a sense, at least in the modern era. That the Everson versus Board of Education, the first case the Supreme Court of the United States ever entered into the public debate about church-state questions, was a public funding case. And so what I do in this chapter is I try to give an overview of some of the history, some of the historical antecedents of this battle over public funding of religious education. And so that's approximately the first half of the chapter. Some of the first battles that occurred go back into the early part of the 19th century, at the same time that public education was just emerging within the public sphere, and that there was, at least in the early eras of public education, somewhat of an intermixing of religious education with public education, and even sometimes some support of religious-based schooling. So I cover some of the earlier funding battles starting in New York City in 1824, and then bringing it through the 19th century development where public education starts really creating a distinct identity. And so it raises this question, of course, that you have a distinct system of public education, then what do you do with these emerging private religious schools, predominantly Catholic parochial schools? And do you provide funding for that? And there are many reasons, I think, why public officials made the decision not to fund private religious education. Some of it was for self-preservation of the public school funds. Some of it was suspicion of Catholic schooling. Some of it was outright bigotry. But in essence, throughout the 19th century, you have this slow development of making these firm lines between the two, going into the post-Civil War controversy that resulted in the proposal to add a specific constitutional amendment to the U.S. Constitution called the Blaine Amendment that would have prohibited all states from funding private religious education. That failed, but many states subsequently adopted similar types of legislation. Sometimes they're called baby Blaine amendments. And these are actually still somewhat in play in litigation. I then shift in the chapter to talk about the modern development of the no funding principle, basically from 1947 to 2002. And the basic lesson to take away from that, and this is the creation of the court's adoption of the principle of separation of church and state, is that notwithstanding saying one thing and saying it rather frequently about separation of church and state, the court's rhetoric was always so much greater or stricter than its holdings. In fact, the first decision where the court announces this in 1947 was one where the court throws down this almost absolutist jurisprudence rhetoric, but then actually upholds the type of funding that was in issue, reimbursements for transportation of children to private Catholic schools. And so really the lesson of this whole debate about public funding of religion is how much is the rhetoric controlling the reality? And the development of public funding questions between 1947 and 2002 has always been a very kind of incremental, slow shift toward greater types of funding to private religious education. That in essence, that notwithstanding some of the things the court said, that there were ways that the court was willing to accept greater types of collaboration and funding of private religious education. The reason I keep saying the state 2002 is because I kind of mark that as a transition point. That was the famous Zellman voucher case out of Cleveland, where the court, even though only by a 5-4 decision, very definitively said that aid that flows to private religious education is permissible so long as it goes through the magic formula of neutral program with private individual public choice. That really is a watershed. And to a certain extent, maybe that kind of ends at least the legal debate about public funding of religious education. The only really threshold that remains that is still there is direct public funding of tuition, but generally all other types of aid now seem to be permissible. And to a degree, this is one of the reasons where I've actually stopped teaching a section on public funding of religious education in my First Amendment classes in law school, because in some ways it's not that much of a legal issue anymore. Okay. But just because it's not a legal issue doesn't mean it's not still a controversial issue. The public controversy over funding of religious education remains, and increasingly it takes on partisan characteristics. With the Zellman decision in 2002, the court gave a green light to vouchers. So there have been some existing plans, the Cleveland plan, the Milwaukee plan, District of Columbia has a plan. The largest plan being the Indiana voucher program. Most of these are oriented toward low-income students in lower-performing schools, but those have all been given the green light. We also have had the advent of things called educational savings accounts, where people can actually contribute to a savings account where the money can then flow to paying for tuition for religious schools. But as I said, they still remain highly controversial, and many states are still rejecting the idea of increasing types of funding for private religious education. These have become somewhat partisan in many instances. And of course, since Mike opened the door, that this book predates Trumpism, there probably are some things we would have said if we'd had wait to go back and do some final editing of the book. One thing that has happened actually legally, I would say, is a case that was last year called Trinity Lutheran Church, where the court actually crossed another threshold and for the first time upheld direct state grants to a church to do facility renovation. And so consequently, that was a significant advance. It had nothing to do with about education per se, but still the court being more willing, more favorable to funding of religious education. That is one thing that's happened. But then we've also seen with the Trump administration, the appointment of a Secretary of Education with no experience in public education. And her experience has been within choice, charter schools. And that has certainly kind of highlighted some of the politicization of these particular issues. That I saw some statistic just the other day that she has spent 4% of her time attending traditional public schools. I'm not sure what the Secretary of Education spends most of their time doing, but at least that was the highlight of that. It was a very low number compared to previous Secretaries of Education. She spent, I can't remember what it was now, so I shouldn't give a figure, but substantially greater time attending and visiting alternative schooling, charter schools, magnet schools, and private religious schools. And so this idea of a Secretary of Public Education focusing primarily on non-public education matters. She has also come out recently in attacking these state baby Blaine amendments, as we call them, that have still placed prohibitions on the funding of religious education. So these issues still remain. And one last issue that is always in the question about funding of religious education that goes back prior to the Brown versus Board of Education, but immediately following, and is still an issue that comes up, is when you are funding private religious education, that lingering questions remained about whether this enhances or alleviates, mediates racial segregation in urban inner cities. It's the Cleveland plan, the Milwaukee plan, of course, are low income. They're based in the inner cities, and they have a high percentage of the children who attend those programs are African American or minority students. But these are all limited programs, and the question is always out there that many people are concerned about, that if there is more of an expansion and opening up of voucher programs or even direct funding of tuition, whether that will actually do the opposite and have effects on enhancing segregation that may occur when more people have the option to opt out of public education. So I guess the takeaway, and I think I'm out of time, the two lessons are interesting that legally some of these issues have been resolved, but at least within the public policy sphere, they still remain very controversial and very contested. And so hopefully the book, not just my chapter, but the book generally, will provide some background, at least some information for people who are curious about these particular questions. Thank you.
My name is Mark Chansey. I'm a professor of religious studies at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. I want to thank Mike and Nate for allowing me to be a part of this book. I think this is going to be the go-to first reference for religion and education. It's just such a wonderful collection of essays, and I'm honored to be a part of it. Thank you to the Committee for the Public Understanding of Religion for hosting this session. My essay is about the Bible and American K-12 public education, and it focuses particularly on the history of the Bible's place in public schools, and especially on the transition from school-sponsored ritualistic Bible reading to the academic, aspirationally non-sectarian study of the Bible. Putting contemporary practices into historical perspective demonstrates just how firmly ongoing debates about the Bible and public education happening today are deeply rooted in past controversies. As I sum up the main points of my article, I'll also make points of contact with those of other contributors. Many modern proponents of increasing the Bible's role in public schools argue that the Bible once played a much more prominent place in the project of American education. And of course, they are correct. My essay talks a little bit about early America, taking its cues largely from Steve Green's work. He's done so much on this, and talks about how in the colonial period and early America, the early republic, the Bible was used not only for spiritual formation, but also to teach reading and morals and biblical material filled primers and textbooks. Because schooling was often usually in the hands of religious organizations, it is unsurprising that the Bible played such a prominent role. When the common school system began to emerge in the mid-19th century, school proponents assumed that the common knowledge that all citizens needed included religious training in the nation's majority tradition, Protestantism. So common school educators incorporated the Bible into their curricula, but also emphasized the importance of daily Bible reading to instill character, morals, and piety. These readings, especially at first, were typically done from the King James Version favored by Protestants. Educators developed a system to avoid offending any particular Protestant church or denomination by reading the Bible without any comment, leaving interpretation up to the student. And they consider this a non-sectarian practice since it did not advance the interests of any particular sect, understood to be a Protestant denomination. This practice was widespread, though not universal, and unsurprisingly, in hindsight, it often prompted controversy. Roman Catholics, Jews, freethinkers often protested it, sometimes along with Protestants who thought that it infringed upon freedom of conscience. Some responded by allowing readings from the Catholic Bible as well. In some areas, Bible reading was stopped. Elsewhere, they dug in with the King James. The controversy was one of the reasons why Catholics developed parochial schools in the 1800s, and why by the end of the 1800s, there was such energy in carrying on the project of having a Catholic school associated with every parish so that Catholic school children would not have to be subjected to Protestant indoctrination. And that history is discussed in the Handbook's chapter on private religious schools with several contributors, including Kate Sewells. As for Protestants, some worked really diligently to uphold this practice of Bible reading, and others opposed it, and well into the 20th century, state legislatures debated and sometimes passed laws promoting or prohibiting school-sponsored Bible reading, with cases ending up in various state courts. So as all of this wrangling over Bible reading was happening in legislatures, courtrooms, and classrooms, Protestant religious educators came up with new ways to find a role for the Bible in students' instruction. Academic courses or academic instruction about the Bible or other aspects of religion, usually Christianity, taught in cooperative arrangements between churches and schools and local organizations, congregations, religious groups. In the 1910s, states began developing plans to ensure that students had access to religious education opportunities, particularly Bible study. North Dakota and Colorado led the way in 1912 and 1913, approving plans for public school students to get credit for biblical instruction. This movement took off so fast that by 1927, at least 33 states gave credit to public school students for getting instruction in biblical studies. The pioneers of this movement named several reasons why such courses were essential. One was evangelism. They needed to reach the unchurched. Unchurched students, their term, might otherwise never encounter the Bible. But, these educators argued, even devout Christian children could benefit from the instruction these opportunities provided. The sad fact, they argued, was that Sunday school was miserably ineffective. The teachers were untrained, the curriculum was shallow, and the students misbehaved, especially, according to many experts at the time, little boys. Public school Bible courses were seen as an antidote to this problem of weak church-based religious education. Of course, the study would also raise morality. It would teach students piety. It would keep them out of jails. It would reduce juvenile delinquency. There were also proponents who grounded their arguments in religious literacy. People can't be educated if they don't know about the Bible. And this whole question of how biblical literacy is related to religious literacy and how that's related to civic formation and religious formation is discussed in Ben Marcus's essay in the book, as well as Walter Feinberg's essay in the book. This move towards courses devoted to religion happened right when the field of religious education was forming and institutionalizing. That's one reason why it happens in this time period. Protestants had long had Sunday school associations. Those were increasingly collaborating in the early 1900s. The Religious Education Association was formed in 1903. In 1922, the International Council for Religious Education was formed. Jewish education agencies were forming in the big cities in this time period. Now, the plans varied in their particulars. Students took religious education classes on campus and off campus, for credit, not for credit, during school hours, outside of school hours. For the most part, Protestants led this movement, but in some cases, Jews and Catholics found ways to participate, and Latter-day Saints had parallel programs starting very, very early in Utah and the Intermountain West, sending students off campus, often receiving academic credit from the school system for their classes. A lot changed with the McCullum court case in 1948. That's a famous story, but one worth telling again for how it reveals tensions around these issues. In 1945, Vashti McCullum protested a plan in Champaign, Illinois, that dismissed students from their regular classes so they could go to religion classes taught inside the school building by representatives of local faith communities. The program in Champaign, Illinois, reflected some intentionality in respecting religious diversity, and that originally it was aimed and designed for Protestants, Jews, and Catholics to take the courses. But the implementation did not match that inclusive vision. The program excluded Jehovah's Witnesses. Jewish students often experienced taunting, and non-participants in the program were criticized. So McCullum withdrew her son from the 5th grade class, and her family was ostracized by many in the community. She filed a lawsuit saying you couldn't have this type of religious instruction in the public school grounds. It violated the Establishment Clause, and this is one of the early cases of the sort talked about by Steve. The program was government-sponsored compulsory religious education, and thus a violation of the First Amendment. So several essays explore these types of issues, not only Steve's, but also one by Charles Haynes and John Witte Jr. and Brian Kaufman. Religious instruction of this type aside, Bible reading had continued in many states, though by the mid-20th century it was no longer as widespread as it had once been. Several cases about school-sponsored Bible reading were making their way up the courts. Two of them were eventually combined for the 1963 decision, Abington v. Shemp. The Shemp ruling famously prohibited school-sponsored Bible reading, although that practice continued well into the 1970s across much of the country, and it still happens today. I heard a story last week of a first-grade teacher who was reading Bible verses to her group of students every morning. No better way to start the day than with a Bible verse, was what she told them. So cases like that are a good example of where Kevin Pregent and Nate Walker's essay on religious expression could come in handy. The Shemp decision, of course, validated academic, non-sectarian study of the Bible and religion more broadly, but how to reach that benchmark of objectivity is the challenge. The devil is in the details. What constitutes objectivity? And here Emil Lester and Walter Feinberg have much to say in the volume. Looking specifically at Bible courses, I'd like to bring the discussion in the book up to date since so much has changed even since then. The level of interest in Bible courses among politicians and political activists remains high. Since 2000, legislators have introduced bills promoting Bible courses in 20 states, and in 7 of those states, the legislature passed them into law. 2 other states passed laws authorizing school credit for release time courses. In 2016, the national platform of the Republican Party urged states to offer Bible electives, citing the indispensability of a good understanding of the Bible for the development of an educated citizenry. A 2017 Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation report on religious freedom contains a sample biblical literacy act, which has already served as the basis for bills. What's fascinating about this is, in many cases, these state laws aren't even necessary if a school district wants to offer a Bible course. Certainly, in terms of constitutional law, it's okay, depending on how they do it. So these courses are taught, whether as English language arts courses or social studies courses, in at least a few school districts in most states across the union. In some cases, they're taught in many schools, as, for example, in North Carolina. Their advocates appeal to the same arguments of a century ago: religious literacy, civic formation, moral formation, curbing juvenile delinquency, and teaching American identity. And often, the course's biggest fans seem to conflate Protestant identity with American identity. These courses leave us with questions. What role should biblical literacy have in the educational programs of a pluralistic democracy in which religious diversity is increasing and religious affiliation is decreasing? Is the political energy devoted to these courses intended to undercut efforts to teach about religion more broadly? That is to say, is this all about culturally privileging the Bible? To end on a theme from Eric Owen's article about common schools and the common good, to what extent do courses about the Bible help cultivate the sort of respect for our diverse citizenship that's necessary to motivate common effort towards a broadly understood common good? For all of the public discussion of Bible courses, that's a question that usually goes largely unaddressed. Thank you.
I'm John Schmaltzbauer from Missouri State University, Department of Religious Studies, and join the other panelists in thanking Mike Wagner and Nate Walker for all the hard work they did, corralling so many people in such well-organized sections, and even having Martin Marty write the foreword, and just what a privilege it is to have all this together. And I know it's a work I'm going to be consulting and using as time goes forward. I want to just say I really appreciate the work of Rhonda Jacobson and her spouse, Jake, and I regret that they're not doing this panel. It's a privilege to step in her absence. Like them, I am I guess a critic of an uncritical secularization history of American higher education that assumes there's no room for the study of religion in universities. We know differently in the AAR, I guess, that religion is taken seriously, and I think their work has really shown that. And so having cited their work, I'm now happy to channel her statement here, which I will read now, Religion and American Higher Education by Rhonda Jacobson. As is evident in the remarks that preceded mine, the Oxford Handbook of Religion and American Education covers a lot of territory, ranging from the theoretical to the empirical and covering all educational levels. The final section of the volume will be of special interest to almost all the people in this room because it focuses on higher education. This is what we do. Most of us research, write, teach, and converse about religion on the playing field of higher education. We are scholars of religion, but it is higher education that pays our salaries and gives us the wherewithal to be the scholars we are. Understanding religion's connections to college and university education is thus not merely a matter of incidental interest. It is existential. This relationship is foundational to how we see ourselves and how we understand our callings as scholars. My chapter in the handbook, co-authored with my colleague, husband, and partner in crime, Jake Jacobson, focuses on private, religiously unaffiliated colleges and universities, and on colleges and universities associated with mainline Protestant denominations. So this chapter is supposed to describe the place of religion at hundreds of independent institutions, plus hundreds more that are religiously affiliated schools, but not Catholic or evangelical. The schools covered in this chapter range from major research universities like Harvard and Vanderbilt to small liberal arts colleges like St. Olaf and Reed, and each school has had its own unique history. Some of these schools have never been affiliated with any church or other religious body. Some were once affiliated with a church, but later disaffiliated. Others remain relatively closely associated with their founding denominations. And finally, some remain connected to their founding churches, but only very loosely. This is a polyglot group of institutions, to be sure, but when it comes to religion, they actually share a common story. The broadish brush story goes something like this. During the early years of establishing institutions of higher education in America, religion in general, and Protestantism in particular, was at the core of American culture, and Protestantism's values and perspectives accordingly had an important shaping influence on all of these schools. Then, during the 20th century, scholars at all of these institutions came to assume, with varying degrees of confidence, that secularization defined the modern flow of history. Given the fact that religion was becoming increasingly irrelevant, educators at many independent and mainline institutions of higher learning began to shift their attention away from religion, devoting their energies instead to more relevant topics like the sciences. Some faculty at these schools, but only a few, began to critique religion more aggressively as an impediment to humanity's full maturation. More recently, dynamic cultural shifts have reversed this trend. The assumption of secularization that defined educational attitudes from the mid to late 20th century has become untenable in light of religion's continuing power and visibility in society. And globalization has revealed the need for religious literacy and interfaith competencies. During this same recent time period, since the mid-1990s, the quest for meaning, personal development, and civic engagement that has always been part of the liberal arts has been reframed in new ways that are appropriate for all students, whether they are traditionally religious, spiritual, or non-religious. Currently, religion is being reintegrated into the curricular and co-curricular programming of mainline and independent colleges and universities, institutions which still enroll more than a quarter of all American college students in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Religion in contemporary American higher education. While the story I have just told is especially relevant for independent and mainline colleges and universities, to some degree, this history constitutes the background narrative for all post-secondary institutions in the United States. Religion was once central to higher education, or higher learning. It was later partially marginalized, and today religion is being re-engaged. What is important to note, however, is that religion being re-engaged today is not the same kind of religion that was central to higher education in the early years of the Republic, nor is it the same kind of religion that was pushed partly out of higher education during the 20th century. In the earliest years of American higher education, religion was perceived as being basically equivalent to Protestant Christianity. Later on, religion came to be defined more broadly in terms of organized religion as a whole, including the full panoply of both Western and Eastern religions. Finally, in recent years, the idea of religion has been stretched even further to incorporate a range of beliefs, practices, and affectivities that extend well beyond the old boundaries of organized religion. Not only are the student populations on today's campuses religiously diverse, but sometimes individual students see themselves as being both secular and spiritual at the same time, and the boundary line between what is secular and what is spiritual or religious is not always clear. This new shape of religion on campuses became blatantly obvious to us about a decade ago when Jake and I were in the early stages of research for the book that would eventually become No Longer Invisible, Religion in University Education. When we began doing group interviews on campuses, we found that those conversations often faltered because the participants brought so many divergent assumptions about and differing experience of religion and spirituality to the table that it was almost impossible for them to communicate with each other. Some people wanted religion to be equated solely with whatever occurs at brick and mortar places of worship. Others wanted religion to be whatever it is that is near and dear to an individual's heart. By the time we finally got around to writing the text of No Longer Invisible, we felt compelled to develop a new adjective that tried to capture the emerging complexity of religion on American campuses. And we came up with the term pluriform. By pluriform, we mean a state of religion characterized not only by religious diversity, but also by a blurring of the lines that have been employed in the past in attempting to separate religion from other ways in which human beings grapple with issues of meaning, purpose, and groundedness in their lives. Religion, as it exists on American college and university campuses today, represents a seamless but multifaceted spectrum of options, ranging from the most traditional expressions of organized religious faith to the most passionately personal and secular ways of learning into reality. Authoring oneself and striving to influence the larger society for the good. Given the reality of the spectrum of spiritual orientations, the reality of pluriform religion, there is no way to draw a sharp line indicating where religion starts and stops. I am quite certain that some people in the room will disagree with what I've just said and would prefer to draw a much sharper line between life orientations that are religious and life orientations that are secular. I appreciate that concern, and I have no desire to turn everything from football to physics into religion. Some things are just what they are, and not much can be gained by lumping them with spirituality or religion. That said, my own experience talking with students, faculty, administrators, and chaplains is that in campus conversations about big questions or things that really matter, the line between the supposedly religious and the supposedly secular is typically blurry, if it is discernible at all. In this new era of pluriform religion, colleges and universities find it increasingly difficult to neatly define religion in ways that allow for policy development. Pluriform religion makes life challenging for administrators, even at public universities, where it has become even harder to apply the constitutional notion of the separation of church and state to the fuzzy realities of religion and spirituality on the ground. In the university classroom itself, professors and students wrestle with whether expressing some deeply held convictions is allowed in a classroom because those particular expressions are secular, while expressing other deeply held conviction is not allowed because they are religious. In a continuum that ranges from convictions arising from traditional religions on one pole and convictions that express atheistic spirituality on the other, simply fencing off both poles doesn't necessarily create any safe space in the middle. One remedy is to simply banish all subjects from campus except for narrowly defined STEM disciplines, but even then, ethical issues will sneak back in, and where ethical concerns are being discussed, spirituality and religion are usually present implicitly or very close at hand. The reality is that pluriform religion is so fluid that it simply cannot be sequestered from campus life. It will inevitably seep into the curriculum and co-curriculum in unexpected ways. This same fuzziness also makes it difficult for religious studies scholars to maintain the comfortable distinction that they can teach about religion while avoiding any hint of teaching or nurturing religion itself. If in a classically Tillichian sense, religion is the beliefs, practices, and affections that we hold most dear, and if, as feminists have taught us, it is impossible to fully bracket personal convictions out of our scholarship and teaching, then the notion that anyone can neutrally teach students about religion without communicating anything at all about what they themselves value religiously or spiritually seems untenable. If this is so, it might make sense to give more attention to issues like transparency and fairness than trying to maintain a classroom facade of neutrality. One of the essays in the higher ed section of the handbook deals directly with this issue. Eugene Gallagher's piece entitled Teaching Religious Studies, Gallagher makes it clear that conversation, or perhaps more accurately contestation, about the goals and purposes of college courses related to religion has been going on for a century or more. While the topic is not new, the clash between disciplinary objectivity and personal meaning in the study of religion remains quite intense. Gallagher uses Barbara Walvard's term, the Great Divide, to describe the chasms between religious studies professors who want to emphasize critical thinking and their students who enroll in those religion courses out of a yearning for personal growth and spiritual development. Gallagher does not take sides in this debate and simply notes that this conversation is far from over. I will be less neutral. While I agree that helping students to view religion objectively, i.e. fairly based on facts, non-judgmentally and critically, is an essential goal for any college or university class dealing with religion, it seems only commonsensical to recognize that students are going to use the material learned in religious studies courses as resources for their own thinking about life and for their development as persons. Somehow, that additional reality needs to be acknowledged and addressed, even if it makes some faculty members uncomfortable. A new framework for understanding religion's presence within higher education. Regardless of whether religion is dealt with objectively, as an external reality, or subjectively as a matter of personal concern for students, the key question at hand is this: how can our colleges and universities engage the topic of religion intelligently, given its current fuzzy, blurry, pluriform state? Many educators simply do not know where to begin. And our proposal, which is part of our essay in the handbook, is to divide the fuzzy whole of pluriform religion into three more easily grasped modes or expressions that we call historic religion, personal religion, and public religion. We're not claiming any brilliant new insight with this vocabulary. These three expressions of religion will be familiar to almost anyone who's engaged in the academic study of religion. But we have found that naming religion in this particular threefold manner has been helpful to many educators, especially those who are not scholars of religion, but nonetheless find themselves needing to deal with religion in their classes or on their campuses. Let me explain this terminology. Religion, in the most common usage of the term, refers to historic religion, the historic traditions and institutions of faith that have formal names like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and Hinduism that are expressed in a wide variety of local groups, communities, churches, temples, and other associations. Religion is more than this single dimension, however. In a second meaning of the term, religion also refers to personal religion, how each person individually connects with the transcendent and makes meaning in his or her life. Sometimes this kind of personal religion overlaps significantly with historic religion, but for many contemporary Americans it does not, which is what the phrase spiritual but not religious is meant to signal. Finally, religion has a public dimension, sometimes called civic or civil religion. Public religion refers to the differing and often contentious ways in which societies seek to articulate their own highest ideals. Public religion varies in both content and intensity across different societies, but it has always played a major role in the public life of the United States, a nation that has traditionally seen itself as having a unique, and many would say God-given mission in the world. All three of these expressions, historic, personal, and public, are evident in higher education's new engagement with religion. This threefold explanation of how religion presents itself in both individual lives and in social contexts can help colleges and universities formulate more nuanced policies related to the places and role of religion on campuses. And it might even help bridge the great divide between religious scholarship and students' personal spiritual formation. Historic religion needs to be both accommodated and critically studied. Personal religion needs to be respected, but not coddled. And public religion needs to be brought out of the shadows so that classrooms can become spaces where constructive conversations about public policies and values can occur. The different chapters in the Handbook's higher education section provide excellent examples of dealing with the new complexity of religion in higher education. And all three expressions of religion weave their way in some way through most of them. Simply looking at the chapter titles, however, is enough to indicate that most of the essays emphasize one expression of religion more than the other two. The chapter on Evangelical Higher Education by Jesse Rhine and Catholic Higher Education by Michael Galligan-Sturl and Paula Moore clearly put most of their emphasis on historic religion. In fact, both of these are mildly apologetic, stressing how much historic religion, in this case two different strands of Christianity, still has to offer to higher learning in the 21st century. Historic religion also provides the main focus for the two other chapters in the section. Daniel Alsher's essay on theological education, which is largely about seminaries and the religious denominations they serve, and John Schmaltzbauer's essay on campus ministry, with campus ministry still largely defined in terms of the historic religious organizations that sponsor and fund these positions. Michael Wagner's essay on religion and spirituality in public higher education also falls into the same category. While Wagner's essay clearly recognizes and addresses all three facets of religion, historic, personal, and public, his essay eventually tilts toward historic religion. There's a good reason for this. Public universities are required to take seriously the separation of church and state. Formulating legal doctrines about the relationship between higher education and religion necessarily foregrounds organized, institutionalized, historic religion, i.e., religion as it is nurtured and maintained by churches. In contrast to these 5 essays, the 2 similarly titled essays on religion, spirituality, and college students by Alyssa Rockenbach and Julie Park, and Religion, Spirituality, and College Faculty by Jennifer Lindholm focus on personal religion much more than on historic religion. For Rockenbach and Park, the main concern is with students as whole individuals and on helping those students develop their own inner lives. Their conclusion is that any commitment to supporting religious and spiritual questions on campuses inevitably includes a commitment to grappling with challenging questions and difficult dialogues. Lindholm's essay on college and university faculty is similarly oriented toward personal expressions of religion rather than historic, arguing that faculty members are not teaching machines, but holistic human beings who hold different values, priorities, overall purposes, and principles that inevitably shape how they live and teach. What matters for Lindholm is not historic religious doctrines, but whether or not a person believes in the sacredness of life, has an interest in spirituality, believes we are all spiritual beings, and feels connected to a higher power. And like Rockenbach and Park, Lindholm concludes her essay with hope and a challenge that colleges and universities can become places that help faculty, staff, and students realize their deepest potential. Robert Nash's essay on teaching about religion outside of religious studies is somewhat different from the other essays in that he really does give careful attention to all three modes of religion, though he does not use the same terminology that we use. However, Nash's predominant theme relates to public religion. Nash is interested in religion because of its social power, because of its enormous potential to unite and divide, its enormous potential to do good and equally to do great harm. In fact, he argues that some kind of instruction in religion should be required of everyone involved in higher education because unattended religious illiteracy throughout the world is worsening, and in its wake are the violent atrocities that make daily headlines in all of the media. For Nash, what matters is not the specific doctrines or rituals of historic religions, nor is it any one individual's personal search for meaning and purpose. For Nash, what matters is the health of the public social life that we share together in the local communities and nations where we live, and what is at stake in the survival of the planet as a whole. Perhaps because he is so passionate about the topic, Nash's essay is also the most practical of all the essays included in the higher education section of the handbook. He provides specific pedagogical recommendations for how to create and sustain an ethic of unbounded religious dialogue in the classroom that eventually, hopefully, will flow beyond campus borders and will nurture the capacity for civil and constructive public conversations outside the academy. I hope it is clear from this brief review of the chapters in the higher education section of the handbook that virtually all the authors believe that American colleges and universities need to be more proactive in their attempts to re-engage religion. Some authors make that case by examining empirical data about religion's already existing presence within higher education. Other authors foreground theoretical arguments about why higher learning could benefit from a more careful and nuanced engagement with religion. But all of the authors agree that religion is and should be a significant concern for American colleges and universities, whether they are church-related or not, and whether they are private institutions or public. I should be equally clear, however, that even if all American colleges and universities would enthusiastically embrace the goal of dealing more intelligently with religion and spirituality, there would still be no single normative model for how those schools should go about it. American college and university campuses vary dramatically in terms of their religio-secular compositions, flashpoints of interaction, resource availability, and desired outcomes. Institutional missions also differ, and institutional histories deeply shape how religion is perceived or rendered visible or invisible in specific campus contexts. Each institution will need to chart its own way forward. Religion, historic, personal, and public religion will not, at least in the foreseeable future, disappear from either American society or American higher education. Colleges and universities of all stripes are going to be required to acknowledge, confront, manage, and perhaps utilize religion's continuing existence in both their curricular and co-curricular programming. In my opinion, a helpful first step in this direction might be for administrators and policymakers to get up to speed by reading the essays in this section of the handbook. Perhaps the handbook could be a holiday present for your local administrator. Just a suggestion. Religion is not disappearing from our campuses, and religion is certainly not disappearing as a global phenomenon. The Oxford Handbook on Religion in American Higher Education does not address all the questions about religion that could or should be raised, but it does provide a hugely helpful resource for advancing the conversation. And that was a text from Rhonda Jacobson.
We'll be able to take questions in just a little bit. I'm mindful about there's a very special tone and quality about all of you that is represented in this book. It's a very collegial tone. I remember co-editing the book Whose God Rules, where we had Martha Nussbaum and Alan Dershowitz and Robbie Jones kind of intellectually at it with each other, and that had a very different tone than I think what you have all created here. And I start by saying that to say that my closing remarks will be more personal, will be more reflecting on the collegial process, and even emotional. I see this as a time capsule in a way, a kind of a way to frame our collegial lives and these various milestones that we've seen each other through. For me, this work begins when I first became a graduate student at Columbia University, and in taking a class on how adults learn in the higher education department, I was learning all kinds of wonderful things about the history of higher ed, the religious origins of it, the religious dynamics of higher ed today. And in that work, we started to study faith development. And that's when I was given the book Big Questions and Worthy Dreams by Sharon Parks, and it blew my mind. And it was in part because of that experience, something shifted in me internally. And externally, something shifted as well. 9/11 happened, and being in New York and watching the towers fall changed many of us and changed many directions in our careers. For me, I decided to go to my church and say, if you let me teach in your religious education program, I can use that to pay for seminary. And they said yes. And so I started this work as a religious educator, working at Union Theological Seminary. And in part, it was Sharon's work that kind of stimulated that kind of collegial kind of calling, that vocation. And so doing that work at Union Theological Seminary and still at Columbia during that time, I was then exposed to this thinker that I just was coming out. I heard he was founding this thing called Interfaith Youth Corps. And who is this guy, Ibu Patel? And being exposed to his work was influential. During that time, the children of this program that I was running, they led this process, and in my ordination as a Unitarian Universalist minister, the children actually preached the sermon at these things, and in it, they reference sort of this importance of having interfaith dialogue, and so that these types of influences had a halo effect. You know, by reading one person's work, it influences one person's career, which influences the people they're influencing. And I see this book as a part of that collegial process. I later went into congregational life, and serving congregations really taught me about the significance of clergy to know the law. And that's when I remember reading this book about Bible and in public schools, and about the second establishment that Steve has written, and that started to influence me. And then that exposed me to Mark's work on Bible in public schools, which then led me to read about Kent Greenewald's work in religion in public schools and the law, which led me to learn more about John Whitty's work and all of that stuff. And then when I finally got the tome that Steve Green and Melissa Rogers did on the Supreme Court, I thought, I have arrived. I am now an official nerd because this is my greatest possession. And so through that, I realized I had to do a doctorate in law. It was just these collegial influences were just getting at my core. And so I was able to take a sabbatical from church life while serving at a congregation in Philly to go to Harvard Div School to serve as a research fellow for a semester. And I had two classes. One was with Diana Eck, and to see her case study model, to talk about pluralism in action, it was fundamentally just changed my DNA. It was incredible influence. And the second class I had was with a woman you might know by the name of Diane Moore. And she had a TA named Brendan. Brendan recently died, and we dedicate the book to him. And what's really, to me, special about that encounter is seeing him be a teaching assistant to Diane Moore in this time, wrestling with these issues of religion and education and law. I got to see great thinkers take all these various readings and things that I had been exposed to put them into new frames for me and to give new kind of theoretical ways to look at these issues. And I was changed by that. And it was in that time was able to meet people like Kate and Sabrina and Adina and Janet and Eric Owens at these various conferences, right? The AAR or the American Education Research Association, AERA, and so on. So those, more and more, the collegial network started to influence me as a person, as a researcher, and in turn, all of this work started to come to being when I remember being at Harvard Div School in the library, and as nerds do, we look through and we're like, wait, they have all these handbooks, but where's our people? Where's the one about religion and American education? And so I remember going to Theo at the AAR conference and saying, what do you think? We really need this. Look at, what if we pulled together these people? They haven't said, we haven't asked them. And he says, you're a doctoral student, right? I think you need to find a senior scholar to take the lead on this. And that's when I have to say that of all these different texts, of all these different opportunities to learn from these scholars, that's when I got to meet and work with Mike Wagner. And I have to say that your character is my greatest text. The way that you work with people, the way that you build ideas and create a mood of collegiality and mutuality is very, very special. And your character has been my greatest text. So with that, I want to just end by saying I see this as a snapshot. I see this as a time capsule in our collective work together. There are many intellectual triumphs, large and small, in this work. And there are also many different collegial disappointments, large and small. I mean, one of our regrets is that Bruce Grelly is not in it. I mean, your life's work has been extraordinary. To be able to work with Charles Haynes, Emil Lester, Susan Douglas, and have their work represented in this has been very special, and you're part of that. So all of that's to say is that this is a snapshot in my individual life, in our collective lives, and it is a very special opportunity to dedicate it to Brendan, who was a good colleague and friend to us, and let that just be a symbol that none of this work is an errand, that truly the greatest gift that we can give one another is our very presence. And it's been an honor to be in your presence today and in creating this handbook. So we're happy to take your questions. If you'll please come to one of the mics, we'd be honored to hear about your insights or inquiries. And of course, of the panelists, if you have questions for each other, we welcome that as well.
Actually, is this on? Okay. Actually, I want to make a comment because as John was reading Rhonda's piece, I found it very fascinating. Willamette University is a historically Methodist college. It's actually the oldest university west of the Mississippi. And we have become very secular, preceding when I was there. I have nothing to do about it, but anyway, a very secular institution. And this thing about how the role of religion in higher education. I teach over the religious studies department as well as in the law school. Most of the students are secular. The reason I'm giving you all this background is we are going through, I shouldn't prejudge this, but very concerted discussions, and I think it's going to happen, that we will be merging with Claremont School of Theology. They're going to be moving up to Oregon. And what has been interesting, I've been serving on the president's committee, the Willamette President's Committee to try to get this working. And what has been really interesting is seeing basically a secular faculty. You know, even though we have a small religious studies department, Steve Patterson's kind of the head of it, but we have a small religious studies department, but generally a secular university. And see all these secular professors, they're kind of like, why? Why would you want to bring on a divinity school? And is that going to change the character of Willamette? And I'm saying, I think it really is going to change the character of Willamette. But, I mean, are we going to become religious now? Are all these guys conservative? You know, what's going to happen? And so It's been this kind of interesting, educational experience, meaning educating some of the secular faculty who are no one's here from Claremont, are they? Okay. Somewhat still very suspicious about this merger. And so, I don't know, maybe in another 2 years, I think this is going to work. Maybe we should put together a panel just to kind of talk about this kind of how this worked out, because it would be a nice kind of case study or snapshot about, I think, what Ron was talking about the way that religion continues to kind of find a role in higher education. Anyway, it's a kind of a personal comment, but I was just thinking about it when you were talking.
Well, that's fascinating because Claremont is really one of the places that is thinking about training multi-faith chaplains and so forth. And if there's a kind of a way of doing divinity school that's tailor-made for the age of the spiritual but not religious and pluriform religion, it would seem that's one of them. And yeah, so I mean, I hope that the faculty that have anxiety realize, Claremont is not liberty or something like that, that there is diversity.
Mm-hmm.
So I also want to acknowledge Ben Marcus, who just stood up, for his extraordinary contribution in the book as well. We're really glad you're a part of it. And you have a question, apparently.
That wasn't why I stood up. But, so I have a question. I think the book is absolutely excellent, but I'm sort of curious what people would want to add. So what do people think is missing, either as an entire section or a chapter in terms of topic? Because when I was reading the book, I was thinking, wow, this is so comprehensive. And then that got me thinking about, is it actually comprehensive, or is there something that's missing related to religion and professional education, or religion and some other topic? So it's just helpful for me to think about where further research needs to be done, or what people are considering.
I'm glad you asked that, because when I was in that library at Harvard looking through stuff, one of the handbooks was on religion and diversity. And in it, I saw no section about religion and law. And so I went to the editor and I said, hey, Chad, will you let me add in a chapter to your already published book, but do it as an online version? And that's actually what led me to meet Theo and so on. And they said yes. So I hope that you, whatever the answer is, if there are chapters that you want to write, that you want to put in here, let's figure out a way to consider it as a part of the online handbook version of this. But to the panel, are there any thoughts on what might be missing?
Just a personal interest. I'm very interested in historically how schools have taught about religion, not just the Bible. I focused in on a very narrow subject, but the whole idea of how religion has fit into different curricular areas, especially the formation of social studies as a field in the early 20th century, how different religious traditions have been treated in social studies, as well as religious literature from a variety of sources in English language arts. So religion overtly, concretely in the curriculum would be, there will always be more room for more work on that.
The chapter on campus ministry, which I wrote, but it was based on a project that Betty DeBerg was the PI for the National Study of Campus Ministries, is exclusively about Christian campus ministries for a lot of practical reasons in terms of the design of the study and the backgrounds of the researchers. But now we realize, I think going forward, if you're going to study campus ministry in the United States and student religious expression, that as Rhonda Jacobson pointed out, that it's really, there's so many different forms now, and with Interfaith Youth Corps and those conversations going on in campus, I think, which is in the volume, but not in a different place. Ibu Patel's in the volume, but I think that just the fecundity of American student religious life is continuing to unfold.
I think I'd like to see something on religion and socioeconomic diversity on campuses. So, like, my time at Vassar has corresponded to sort of the rapidly increasing commitment to need blind and socioeconomic diversity, and where Vassar, I think we still continually rank #1 in terms of the least religious campus in America. I'm finding that as the student body gets more socioeconomically diverse, that we're getting students who are freer in identifying themselves as religious. And I think this, the commitment to sort of higher education, at least, and economic justice and fairness is something that could be thought through in terms of religion.
One additional thought I had was, the book covers so much ground, and of course one can't cover everything on religion. It's so expansive, but Jewish theological education, these early forms, new professionalization of Islamic theological education, imam training they're specifically North American forms, other religious traditions. So the discussion of theological education per se, there's room there for some more as well.
Great. Well, that would just give us more opportunity to expand our collegial circles more and more, to have the opportunity to learn from one another. Please stay in touch, and we look forward to working with you all in the future. Take care.